Hi, everyone. I'm Dorothy Vu, and I'm a Senior Communications Specialist in NEA's ESP Quality Department. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight for what is such an important and necessary conversation about institutional racism, something we all know impacts not only our educators, but our students of color, their families, and everyone else in our communities. Our first presenter is Dr. Adrian Dorrington, a Senior Policy Analyst in NEA's Teacher Quality Department. Adrian will be leading a discussion on institutional racism and how it's embedded into school policing. After that, we'll hear from Vanessa Jimenez, president of the Phoenix Union Classified Employees Association, who will talk about school policing at the state and local level. Their presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with two NEA members, Joe Sells from Arizona and James Frazier from New Jersey, who will be sharing their experiences as security service professionals and offering solutions. As Jessica mentioned, if you have any questions during this presentation, you can ask them through the Q&A feature. So please ask your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat so that the presenters can get to them at the end. All right, so now I'm going to pass it over to Adrian, who will start us off.
And thank you so very much. I want to thank my colleagues, Jessica and Dorothy. We go back quite some time working together. So I'm always thrilled to have the opportunity to work with my fellow colleagues in this struggle here, and especially around institutional racism, but many other issues we've worked on together. So this evening, we're going to move to the next slide here. I have to say that this here topic is so timely, but it has been timely for decades. It has been timely for centuries. And for many of you, you live this each and every day as I have. And I hate to count the number of decades I've been dealing with this issue. However, I have developed what I consider to be a pretty ambitious agenda for tonight with the goals and so on. I'm not going to touch upon every slide. However, you'll have the opportunity afterwards to go through the slides with your time at your leisure to unpack the things that are there. But what I want to really do is scratch the surface about developing the awareness of institutional racism in policing, its impact on school resource officers. And I got an asterisk there, because even though I'm focusing on the school resource officers, it will include other personnel who work within the security services or have responsibilities related to school discipline and overseeing the safety related matters as it involves the students. We're going to look a little bit at implicit bias and then explore equitable practices and policies, looking at it through the lens of your ESP professional learning continuum. So the next slide, Jessica. So before I get started, I want to use at least give a working definition. This is the NEA definition for institutional racism. Discriminatory treatment within an organization or organizations that give rise to unfair practices, biased practices based on race that will result in equitable outcomes for whites over people of color and extend beyond prejudice. Most institutional racist policies will not have the word race in there. It will not even mention race in there, but you can tell by reading through the subtext that it will provide advantages to whites over people of color. Now, I want to jump to the end of this story. You may know that institutional racism in policing started with slavery. And even though that we had the amendment, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, what it actually said is that it abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime. So what was ever deemed crime by then law enforcement officers will allow the continuation of enslavement or in slavery. And so law enforcement and slavery and racism has been linked from the very beginning of time. So I just want to jump to the end of the story, just in case you didn't know how this story ended. Okay, next one, Jessica, sorry. As we look through these images, and Jessica's going to flip through them for me, what comes to mind when I use the word police officer? What thoughts, images? Here's an image, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And I'm sure there are many other images, but just hold that thought for a moment. What images come to mind? And I've given you several images here to consider, which may or may not coincide with your images. Next slide. When I use the word school resource officer, what images or thoughts come to mind? Image number 1, image number 2, and image number 3. If we think about this, we're moving to the next slide. If we think about this, in some cases, we can have images and thoughts about, and bring up the next one there, Jessica. There could be an overlap. There could be actually two distinct circles, and I'm using Venn diagrams here, that the images and thought you had about a police officer were totally separate from that of a school resource officer. But more often than not, there are some areas of commonality. And then we look at the next one, we can have a whole lot of commonality. There could be a great deal of overlap. And for some of our students, they see very little difference in the school resource officer and the police officer in some cases. But the question I want to pose, what determines the degree of overlap? Again, what determines the degree of overlap when I use those two images, police officer and school resource officer? Hold that thought for a moment. Moving on to the next slide, please, Jessica. Let me just talk a little bit about the history of the school resource officers, because that's kind of where this policing and the law enforcement and all that kind of has his genesis, if you will. The SRO program, some of you may already know this, started in the 1950s in Flint, Michigan. It was a form of community policing where the school resource officers would be one and together working hand in glove with the community to support the learning of the students in that school. In 1970, the school districts across the United States started to create their own police departments. By the time we got to 1973, the National Advisory Commission on the Criminal Justice System said that if there are any law enforcement agencies that employed 400 plus more employees, it was highly recommended that they would assign a full-time police officer to junior and senior high schools. So that notion of full-time didn't start till 1973. By the time we get into the 1990s, we're now getting into an era where there's more and more school shootings. And so SRO programs grew in the 1990s to try to push back these increasing amount of school shootings. By the time we get to 2018 with Parkland, Florida, the United States Department of Justice was now pouring millions of dollars into the SRO programs. So the next slide. When they started back in 1950, and we're talking, God, 70 years ago, when they started back, there are three areas of focus for the SRO programs. One, the very first one, is that they would be kind of like a teacher. They would be a member of the faculty and administration. They would be guest speakers. They would be in the classroom, constantly in the classroom, working hand in glove with the teacher. They would provide law-related education to students, staff, and members of the community. So their number one focus back in 1950 was that of a pseudo type of classroom educator. The next layer of responsibility was that of a counselor. They would be working hand in glove with the school counselor. Obviously, they're an informal counselor, but again, provide information to the communities around, opportunities as it related to law enforcement, so forth and so on. But that was the second category. The third category was that of a law enforcement officer. Notice, the third category was a law enforcement officer. This is where they were to serve the school community. And they would know how to serve the school community because they were working hand in glove with the school community. They would serve as a liaison between the school and the policing community, and they would serve as a positive role model. That's in 1950. That's where we started. And we move to the next slide. Here's kind of where we are right now. And we move to the next slide. We will find that, yeah, teaching was still there. Teaching's kind of still there. Counselors kind of still there. But the role and responsibility of the law enforcement officer just mushroomed. And when we talk about a law enforcement officer, the SRO, whatever, serving the school community, it was now as deemed by the SRO as a school resource officer. That whole notion of the community and the school resource officer working hand in glove, it started to fray. In some cases, it completely has dissolved the cloth. And another thing that has happened is that as these law enforcement responsibilities started to grow, we started to see more research coming out. We started to see more consequences of what happened when that third category started to evolve and started to take over and kind of push away the other two categories. Can we go to the next slide, please, Jessica? We will see here This was a study done in 2013. And in this study that was done in 2013, the question in this study was, what school factors impact the decisions the SROs make as to whether or not to arrest students? What school factors? Well, in this particular study, remember, it's only 2013, we're talking 7 years ago. 37% of the student arrests, the SRO said that they arrested these students because they were disrupting class. 55% said they were arrested students because the teachers wanted them arrested. 68% of the people involved in the study said they arrested the students to teach them a lesson. And 77% who arrested students said it was to settle a student down. Their behavior was of the Richter scale. Now, all of this now starts to shape that image. So let's go on to the next slide. And you keep flip it again, Jessica, and again. Remember I asked you a question a couple of slides ago? What was the degree of overlap between the police officer and that of the student resource officer? Well, that degree of overlap is shaped by your experiences. It is shaped by your lived experiences. It's shaped by what happens in the school system. It's shaped how you experience either the school resource officer as a student in the classroom or as a member of the community, or how you experience the policing as, again, as a person driving along the highways, or how you interact with them. In other words, the degree of overlap between police officers and school resource officers is shaped by our lived experiences and our biases. Our biases shape what one sees, and it also shapes how we react. So when you think about the allegations of and evidence of racial profiling, that comes out of institutional racism, and that shapes how we interact with policing or police officers. When we talk about over-policing in brown and Black neighborhoods, again, that is a symptom of institutional racism. And when we talk about their model to protect and serve, the question that is begging to be asked, to protect and serve who? As we move to the next slide. Oh, by the way, just before we move to this slide, I don't have time tonight, and I really apologize because I actually did up a presentation like for 2 or 3 hours. I thought we could kind of spend the evening together. But when you have this pack of slides afterwards, I really invite you to look at this YouTube clipping I have here, because it actually talks about how a student, how we tend to see what we want to see. And it's a very good video. So I really invite you to watch that after the fact. Let's move on to the next one, please, Jessica, because I'm mindful of my time here. In terms of biases, our biases can be explicit, and explicit biases are not a big thing because you already know them. You know that you don't like this group of people, you're not fussy about this group of people, you don't like going to this part of the world, you don't like, we wouldn't want to visit this country, you don't like this food. You know what you like and what you don't like, and you know kind of why you like it or why you don't like it. It's the next part. It's the implicit biases that can be very problematic. When you have certain stereotypes or certain attitudes towards certain people, towards certain things, and you just bristle when certain people are around, or you bristle when you hear certain words, or when you bristle, those are all triggered by implicit biases. They are activated automatically. You have no control over that. You have no control over your implicit bias, because these are things you don't know that you have. Implicit means hidden. They tend to favor your own group. You tend to be more pro. For example, if I have implicit bias, I'm likely to be more proactive or more sensitive or more empathetic to groups who look like me, who act like me, who sound like me. And these implicit biases are shaped from the beginning of time, from the moment that you can recognize, and we're talking about months-old babies, when they can start to recognize their context, and they know that certain things will operate if they do certain things certain way. But they can be gradually unlearned. But first, we have to know that we have them. Next slide, please, Jessica. And one thing that triggers implicit bias, one thing that will trigger our biases, are optics, what we see. Remember these 4 diagrams we see? If I ask you which one resonates with you the most, you will find that your lived experiences will trigger. Now, if I was from Ferguson, a Black woman living in Ferguson, Missouri, the likelihood the upper left, the upper right, and the lower left, those are two optics that kind of shape how I view the police. If I lived in areas whereby there was a very strong community policing and the police officers in our neighborhood walking the beat all the time, just talking, just hanging out talking, I might see that police officer in the middle. I just might. And after the George Floyd situation, we saw quite a few police officers in the lower right taking a knee. But for most of us and for most of our students, that particular picture in the lower right is not one that we are familiar with or that resonates with our lived experiences. So optics are extremely important. How things look, how things are presented, and they shape our biases, or they reinforce our biases, or they can sometimes call our biases into question. Think for a moment, side of a police car. The moment you see a police car, your implicit bias will kick in. And what you do and what you see, either you visually see or you see in the mind's eye, can be dependent on whether you're a Black male, a white female, a white male, a Native American female. It will depend upon those lived experiences. For some of us, it could be that we start to slow down, automatically slow down. We weren't even speeding, but we're slowing down. The heart can start racing. Oh my God, are they following me? Or get off the highway. I'll take another route or let them pass. Optics, just aside of a police car, will trigger actions. Next one, please, Jessica. As I said before, our implicit biases are developed over a course of a lifetime. They come from all different types of messages, direct and indirect. Now, implicit bias, they have pros and cons. There's a yin and a yang, because our implicit bias allows us to operate, quote unquote, normally, because we have thousands and thousands of messages and thousands of bits of evidence and data that are entering our psychic every minute of the day. We can't take time for every message that we see to analyze that message. We save our upper brain power, we save that power for more complex solutions. And so we operate on autopilot for a lot of it. And so if you think of it with that hydrant down the bottom, you can click the next one too, Jessica, to show the two pictures. The hydrant down the bottom, that's how many messages are coming through at a regular and bombarding us. So we cannot drink, no matter how thirsty you are, you can't drink and be satisfied your thirst from a water, by drinking from a fire hydrant. So the implicit bias, that part of our brain, helps us to operate normally. But again, it can be positive or negative. And we have to understand how sometimes our biases will reinforce inequity and how we have to call out our biases, our implicit biases. But we can't call that out until we unearth it, until we discover that we have an implicit bias. Once we discover it, it's no longer implicit. It now becomes explicit. Moving on to the next one. I want you to, I'm going to ask Jessica to play this short clip and we'll look at the biases in the clip. I want you to look at the optics, and I also want you to take a note of the language, the words that you hear.
Funny how the media covers white riots versus black protests.
Breaking news.
Seems like when the protesters are black, the media uses some pretty harsh words.
The bad guys. Lawlessness, looting,
Wild animals.
Criminals and thugs.
Thugs. Isn't it the right word?
However, if you're white and you're tearing up the city because of a game, you're just young people.
Young people danced on a flipped-over car.
As UK fans did stupid things.
Some maybe got a little out of control.
Seeing a scene like this just shows how passionate the UK fans are.
It's so tough to lose, and unfortunately the ugly side that we sometimes see in sports.
And notice how the police always show up to a black protest in military-grade equipment, and yet the media claims they're just doing nothing.
It's inexplicable why the police are doing nothing.
Let's mobilize the National Guard.
If I'm a rioter and I see the police doing nothing, I might feel like I have a license.
You would.
But at white riots, the cops actually are standing around doing nothing.
Another group of cops over there just standing there.
No one was really doing anything.
These guys look like they could be watching a parade. And why is it that the leadership of the black community is always called into question?
Where is the leadership?
Leadership.
The black leadership.
The absence of leadership.
And it goes back to leadership, but that leadership has to come from the community.
But no one ever questions the leadership of white parents who let their kids burn down and vandalize their college campus.
These are just young college students who think they're playing some kind of a game with police officers.
You know, sometimes they don't even call a white riot a riot.
Party gone awry.
Some fans got a bit too rowdy after the win.
A dispute. A bloody brawl.
There was some type of altercation.
Waco, 170 arrested, 9 people dead.
They're not thugs.
Baltimore, no deaths, but it's a riot, chock full of thugs.
Thugs.
Just thugs.
What if the media portrayed white rioters the same as black protesters? Let's switch the audio and see how it plays out.
Breaking news, violent protest.
What you're looking at is the unraveling of the civil society.
Criminals and thugs.
And they're raising hell and they're destroying property.
These idiotic thugs, rioting and looting, are hurting their own people.
Wild animals burning buildings down.
Especially if they know the media's all there, right? Got the cameras on everyone. It's become its own reality show.
Who acts like that towards a police officer?
Think for yourself. Don't let racist media color your perceptions. Demand fairness in media coverage. Tell the media to put an end to calling black.
And so in that video, that short video, yes, it's about the media, and a lot of our biases are shaped by the media. But as we go on to the next slide that Jessica will bring up in just a moment, even though we're looking at it there, let's think about the words that we use in our own work. School police officer, school security officer, school resource officer, campus safety advisor, dispatcher. We are very familiar that these words will have different connotations for some people, but sometimes we use different labels, but they're the exact same role and responsibility. So we need to understand how we, in our own respective communities, in our own respective professions, how we use the language, what labels we use, and what message are we trying to convey. Next slide, please, Jessica. And we can skip this one, because I kind of mentioned this already. The power of optics. As I said before, this is from your own professional growth continuum. This is at the beginning of your security services with your standards. The next one is the picture on the front page of the National Association of School Resource Officers. When we look at the one on the left, this image reinforces many of our biases that we have around law enforcement officers. It reinforces it. But look at the image on the right. The image on the right, and I'm sure that Jessica and Dorothy can speak to this, it was intentional in terms of the message, because that particular image conveys a totally different message than the image on the left. Moving to the next one, please, Jessica. If you look at your ESP professional growth continuum, you have your 8 standards, and through any one of these standards, you can develop and start to use the standards as a framework to unpack institutional racism. It can unpack biases, implicit biases, your social and racial justice, all those discussions. You can use your standards as a backdrop for that. And if we move on to the next slide for a moment, please, Jessica. Irregardless of which standard, and I would contend that 2 standards really stand out to me. One is communication, one is cultural competence. But irregardless of which standard you tend to use as your framework in terms of unpacking institutional racism or trying to advance social and racial justice. Number 1, the program, the process, everything starts with you first. You need to be accountable. You need to examine or interrogate what are your own biases that are somehow negative and is holding back or being complicit in maintaining inequity. The process starts with you. Once you examine and interrogate your own belief system and your own value system, then you must take action. And when you take action, how are you going to counter the unjust, inequitable beliefs or frameworks that you have been harboring since you were 3 years old, since you were 5 years old, since you were 15 years old? How are you complicit in maintaining inequity? First of all, we examine ourselves and then we take action. And as we move on to the next slide, we can look at then going into our ESP families or our ESP as a whole family. Then we start, these are possible ways that we can use your standards to help unpack implicit bias, the power of language, messaging, and so on, focusing on social and emotional development of students and so forth and so on. I've given you a list there. But long story short, the end of the day, the most important commodity, the most important person in our whole profession is that of the student. And when we think of our students, we have to be the very best we can be in our given profession to make sure that our students are successful. You might have heard once upon a time about the Maasai tribe. The Maasai were considered to be very powerful and celebrated warriors that primarily lived in Kenya and northern part of Tanzania. And when they met one another, they would always greet one another with Ngera Sapati, meaning, how are the children? And they would respond back, Sapati Njera, the children are fine. I ask each and every one of you, if I were to ask you, how are your children? Can you actually say your children are fine? Because if our children are not fine, if our village is not fine, if our community is not fine, our nation at large is not fine. So those are some things I want to leave you with, and I'm going to turn this over to Vanessa.
Good evening, and thank you for giving me this space. I'm a student recruiting specialist in Phoenix, Arizona, but I'm also the president of our Classified Employees Association. Proud president, I guess you can say. Next slide. So I think some of what Adrian spoke of in thinking through how we have grown up or our lives, I think we all can remember at some point in time of, depending on where we saw officers as children, you're in the grocery store and I remember my mom saying to me, you better behave or I'm gonna have the officer arrest you. Or, you know, if you don't listen to me, I'm gonna have him take you to jail. So we've already started instilling, and it's generational. My mom said it to me, and I know I've said it to my children, that it's a us against them. I even recall driving. If you don't put your seatbelt on, they're gonna take mommy to jail. So we've already created that language that is scary to our kids. And so we have to work at that. And I think that's something we all have to really start thinking through, the language and how we use it. And we've started that notion, and it's never too late to change how we start having those conversations with our kids, and instead asking them, hey, did you see officer so-and-so? Maybe he has a sticker. Tell him to have a good day, so that we start creating a positive relationship instead of a negative relationship with our kids. Next slide, please. In schools, the messaging, it's hard. I know in Arizona, and it's mostly in urban or in our communities of color, you're gonna see that police car out front. You can drive around the state, and in more affluent areas, you won't see the car out front unless something happened. So it's become a norm to our students that the police officer is there because of classroom management issues. Like, I'm gonna go in and address behaviors. And that's not what it should be. It should go back to, as Adrian said, the law-related studies, teaching students about the law and starting that notion of politics with our students. It's also that scare tactic. If you don't behave, I'm gonna have officer so-and-so come into the classroom. Like, we have to change that messaging. And it, like I said on the last slide, we've started it by that us against them language. So we have to change the messaging so that our students and our communities feel safer at schools, and that officer is not there just for bad things. He's there for good things as well. If you can change to the next slide, please. Something that's really big, and in Arizona we see it a lot, is the grade level differences. In our community of color, you have your elementary schools that are usually kinder through 8th grade, and there's one police officer, one vehicle out front. But seeing that, what does that say to the parents? What does that say to the students if you're having that at an elementary school? Automatically, it scares our parents, it scares our students, because they are already thinking the officer is just there waiting for something to happen. He's not there because he wants the safe environment. He's there because something's gonna happen. And that's an anxiety that raises on not just our students, but on our families. When you think of the difference of high school, you have whole teams. You have a security team, and that SRO is part of the team. It's a difference because now he has, I guess for lack of better words, he has backup or the security team has backup. And knowing that they're part of a team, it's a little bit easier, but it doesn't help because that vehicle's out front. And so students have learned, if they're in an urban district or a community of color, that car has been there since kindergarten. So how do we change from kindergarten all the way through high school, how the interactions or how our students feel about having the police officer on their campus? Because it's become a norm. And unfortunately, it's a norm that only we can work on changing, and putting that need on the resource officers of going back to being that friendly person or that safe person that our students and our families can come to. Next slide. So thinking about safety on a whole, I work with a lot of schools, middle schools as well as our high schools, but we have to look at language, changing it from security to safety. We're not here to secure buildings. We're not here to secure cars. We're here to make sure our students are safe so that they can learn. So that's one thing we have to really start looking at, is how do we change that over from security to safety, whether it's in titles of positions. I know in my district, we're starting to change the titles from security to safety, but also looking at safety as a community issue. I remember they're gonna know before I even get home. Like my mom knew before I got home what I had done, but it was because safety was a security, was part of the community. Everybody watched out for the kids. It's the village mentality. All of the kids are ours. So school and home, it all went together. So we have to start taking our communities and the safety of our communities back, so that our students feel safe all the time. And thinking through past and present of school safety, like I said, my mom knew before I even got home if I had done something. And I think most of us here tonight can remember that my grandmother, somebody told on us. But now thinking of our sites, most of our ESPs live and work in the community. They work at the schools where they live in. So looking at those familiar faces and building those relationships so that the families who've been there year after year, they're gonna come to the school and they're gonna look for Vanessa, or they're gonna look for a James, or they're gonna look for a Joe, because that's what safety means to them. And they know that's a standing figure in the community. So our ESPs 9 out of 10 times are gonna be those safe faces. So we have to also start looking at that on a whole so that our families remember that that's where the safe space is. So taking that piece back for our ESPs. Next slide. So I think always we want to have a plan, like we can talk about it, but we got to be about it. So we need to start addressing our campus safety needs. Yes, at a grade level. Do we need SROs at an elementary school? Or don't we? Are they there in plain clothes, more doing the teaching that it was supposed to be? So really looking at from kindergarten through high school, how are we going to change those roles and kind of take that position back and make it what is most needed for that school? Safety plans, I think a lot of times there's a nice small group of people who come up with this amazing safety plan, and then something happens and it doesn't work, but the person who's able to calm everyone down and bring them down was the person who wasn't even on that planning team. So if you think of our safety plans, we need to create them together. All ESPs, all job families, teachers, administrators, all together, because 9 out of 10 times, we see those kids as family. So we're gonna think through, how do I keep them safe? And sometimes some unconventional ways and not the box ways that are sold to schools as safety plans. So we have to really start taking those plans seriously and asking to be at that table when a school is creating a safety plan that you work at. And then our safety teams, one, changing the name from security to safety teams. That's what they're there for, is to make everyone feel that they are in a safe space to learn. And that's what's most important. So looking at our ESPs who make up probably 99% of our safety teams, and empower them to be the experts, and then allow them to train us on what they've seen and what they've been through. Their experiences could save lives, so let them own these safety teams and let them own these safety plans. And lastly is training. I cannot stress enough that sometimes we get so caught up on training for one job, family, or another, but I think the training has to be everyone. And it's an investment and a value. When we start training, and the more ESPs we train, they're going to feel valued. They're going to see that investment in themselves, and the work is going to be so much more meaningful. And like Adrian said, the PGC, the professional growth continuum, there's 2 standards that should already be what we look to, that communication standard and the cultural competency standard. They are amazing. And if we get all of our ESP job families, all 9 of them together, at least on those 2, safety will be so much easier because everybody's going to be on the same page. So one of those things I would tell everyone to take back is really start looking at those 4 things. How do we plan to make these 4 changes in your schools, your districts, or even if you're a parent, how do you become a part of that team? So I want to say thank you for giving me this space to speak on Arizona. Most of our districts have chosen to stop using SROs. And that's where we need to look at these plans and be so much more, make it so much more meaningful and collaborative so that we can make sure we take safety back. Thank you so much for giving me this space, and back to you, Adrian. You're on mute.
Thank you, Vanessa. You would think that Vanessa and I sat down side by side when we did our presentations, because we so reinforce each other, the messages that each one of us brought, the importance of language, how we sometimes use language, and we're complicit in maintaining inequity in our usage of language. And the other thing that she talked about was the importance of teams. And again, as we think in terms of teams, when you think about a team, how collaborative is the team? And in your team, not only how collaborative are you within the team, but how collaborative, or how does that team, its vision, its mission, its value system align with the school? And by the school, I'm talking about the school staff and the students. And how does that team align its value system with the community? So the team is extremely important, but the team is only part of, think of it like a machinery with all these cogs. So those are things I would call upon. And as Vanessa said, when they're starting to change the names from security to safety, the moment I hear the word safety, it rings differently. It triggers different biases than the word security. So again, thank you very much, Vanessa, for sharing all of that. We're going to now turn to the panelists, Joe and James, and we'll have a couple of questions for the panelists. And I'm going to call upon James because James has a very important date. And these are some of the questions, and I would like James to use his lived experience, to ground the questions, and they're very generic. And James, if I were to ask you what's the most urgent safety issue that needs to be addressed in order to achieve a more equitable, safe, student-centered learning environment, what would you say that is, and what's your rationale for choosing that as you consider to be the most urgent in light of where we are today?
Well, thank you for your question, Dr. Dorrington, and good evening, everyone. And thank you all for taking time to be a part of this much needed webinar. I would say the most important urgent safety issue is to address what we've definitely have seen come to highlight during this pandemic, which is the systemic inequalities that are pervasive in our society. That being said, we have to look at the social emotional outlook of our students. To learn, children and adolescents feel safe and supported, but without these conditions, the mind reverts back to a focus on survival. A lot of times, many of our students may come to school with a bad day, and they may have issues of food insecurity, clothing insecurity, medical attention when necessary, and they may need to have somebody that they can actually approach to say, listen, I'm having these issues. And I think if we as school safety security officers are better trained in learning to address these needs, because these comprehensive supports are uses that a need-based approach, and it needs for us to take a whatever it takes mindset. Again, the security officers need to be immersed in the total social emotional learning of the total child. A healthy and safe and supportive learning environment, it definitely enables our students as well as the adults, even in the schools, as a school to learn in powerful ways. Our part as school safety officers help to ensure that that environment promotes innovation, and it definitely it definitely reinforces the enhancements of the school leadership capacity for our students. We've seen that when our students are handled with a total approach, and that's a school security officer, they go on to become outstanding products in their community, and as well as the community itself is now a part of the team of working with our students.
Thank you very much, James. And may I ask you a question? And for some people who may have jumped on here late, what is your actual title and what grade level do you work with, and how many students would be under your purview there that you work with?
Okay, I'm a school security officer. I work in Union, New Jersey, and there's about roughly around 7,500 students in our school district. And I presently am working with the high school student population, but I have worked in the middle school as well as the elementary in my 25-year career.
Thank you very much, James. And again, when I think of a whole child learning, I always put ESP at the top, because you folks have done an excellent job in terms of understanding, because for classroom teachers, I'm a classroom teacher. And I would say one of our downfalls for many of us is that we see the student through the lens of the subject in which we're teaching, be it the biology or be English or whatever the case may be. But more often than not, my association with ESPs have been that you folks have a tendency to see the entire student. You do not see just the math, you just do not see the geography, so forth and so on. So you really hold that terrain, and you've done a great job doing that. So Joe, I'm gonna ask you the same question. Can you start out with what your title, your grade level that you work at, and the number of students? And the question again, what would you consider would be the most urgent safety issue? And if you're going to try to create this equitable learning, student-centered learning environment, and why would you think it's important?
Okay, yes. My name is Joe Sells, and I'm a campus safety supervisor. That's a new title that we've gotten away from. Position used to be lead security, but as we move forward in changing the name and the thought process, our district have gone to the campus safety supervisor. And so the biggest thing that I see, also I work at the high school level, and at the high school that I work at, we have about 2,800 students. And I've been working on that campus for 25 years. So, I've seen a lot of things, and I think a lot of times the lack of understanding is one of the biggest safety concerns, and the social and emotional aspect of our students. And as we move forward, we're identifying and trying to implement more positive things for kids. And when we're doing that, we're getting the kids involved in some of the decision making that affects them. And so as we do that, we within our district, we just did a panel with our African American students talking about how things are going as far as dealing with police officers and things like that. And it was very interesting because that was something that we've done for the first time. And when you talk to the kids, you find out a lot of information and things that they're going through socially and emotionally, and how it's really affecting them. And definitely during this time, during during the COVID issues. I think we have to do a better job of helping our students with the social and emotional part of, and making sure that we have people to assist them, and not so much more of SROs and more so social workers and interventionists to help assist our students to come up with better ideas and things to help them cope with these situations.
Okay, great. Let me ask you this question, Joe. You indicated that you have undergone a name change. How has a name change impacted the responsibilities that you did before the name change and now? And the other question is, how has your, let's say, the image or the understanding of your new name, how has it impacted perhaps the image or the reception you get now from the students and or your colleagues?
Well, I think the name change definitely makes a big difference, because instead of seeing as security, more of it as a safety, and then also the community attaches to that safety part, because that's what they're looking for, is that safety net to ensure that when they send their kids to that campus, they know that that person who's in charge of safety takes it serious, and and look at all the aspects of making sure that the safety aspect is carried out.
Okay, good.
And
Thank
so,
you.
and I take pride in that. And then also, I'm very familiar with the community. So sometimes when parents come to the campus and something drastic might have happened with their student, and when they see me, they know me. So they feel a whole lot better, because they've dealt with me maybe as a student or, in a different capacity.
Thank you. James, how have you or could you use your ESP Professional Growth Continuum, your standards booklet, to develop a deeper coalition of support within and among your ESP career families? Because you have 9 families. So how could you or have you already used your Professional Growth Continuum?
Well, first and foremost, the ESP Professional Growth Continuum is probably one of the greatest documents that I've had the opportunity to be a part of and to bring to my district. It was something that gave us the opportunity to say that we matter, as ESPs. It also gave us an area to say this, well, these are standards that we want to see us as being professional within our chosen career paths. What's awesome about it in my own chosen profession as being a security officer, it allowed us to one, develop lines of how for us to develop communications with the staff as well as with the administration, that collaborative partnership. It also allowed for us to have the cultural competencies. It allowed me to sit at the table with our assistant superintendents, our building administrators, to develop curriculums that is tailored to the school security officers in order for us to make us a better quality, more productive individuals within our school community. It also has allowed for us to look at it under the professionalism and us tackling the institutional racism and the systemic inequalities, because of the fact that now we are a part of that team, and now we're given the same type of programs in order for us to have ourselves put in the right direction for us to be more productive for our students as well as our school community and our profession. So like I said, this is one of the greatest documents in my 20 plus years of working that I can't say enough about it. So I was actually very, very excited to be a part of it.
Excellent. I have one more question. I know that you have to take off to your next meeting. I have one more follow-up question for you, James. Is there one standard in particular, or the top 2 standards that really resonate with you, that you felt that you've been able to work with your ESP family that has been most productive in terms of increasing either your effectiveness, your productivity, or helping you to advance social and racial justice? Is there any 1 or 2 standards that really stood out for you?
Well, one would be communication, and as well as professionalism. For years, as we all know, ESPs were not thought of as, professionals within the school community. So by us by us having this document, so our administrators can see that, yes, we have the standards, we have areas in which we can see ourselves as being proficient, and so forth. So those are the two areas that I thought and I have used in order to accentuate what we've done as ESPs within our school community.
Thank you very much. And again, for the rest of you, on behalf of the rest of the group here, I want to thank you very much, James, for participating. I know you're running off to another meeting. Yes. And again, thank you so much for adding to what this really rich discussion tonight. And I look forward to working with you again in the very near future.
Same here. Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Joe, this leaves you to carry the panel session.
All righty.
Well, you got broad shoulders.
Best I can.
You got broad shoulders. I'm going to ask you the same question I asked James. Have you or could you use the ESP Professional Growth Continuum to develop a deeper coalition within either your particular family or across your ESP career families to achieve this more, this more equitable, safe, student-centered learning environment? So what have you done?
I think as our district have moved forward, like I said, in changing our job description. So for me, there's more things that I'm required to do as far as training. I'm required to train my folks, but in the past, I've not only trained my group, I've also trained some of our front office folks in doing customer service and different other collaborative and motivation and working on communications, and because those things are very important. And if we're all learning and teaching the same goals and values and making sure that we're all on the same page, then that works to benefit us in the long run, because now when it comes time to negotiate for more money and things, then we can say, hey, through our ESP Professional Growth Continuum, we've worked to improve those things so that when those monies are being brought up, that we're a valuable part of that conversation, and they can't deny that we haven't had the training or the knowledge, and that definitely, that ESP Professional Growth Continuum definitely helps us to grow as professionals and to assist us in the knowledge that we need to further our careers and our folks within our group.
Okay, let me ask you a follow-up question, Joe. When you talked a lot about training, and I concur with you. For the longest time, ESPs were like an afterthought. For the most part, they were not thought of as professionals within the educational system. But as you go through your training, talking about being more seen as professionals, have you ever done any type of cross training? In other words, you hold training sessions, PD sessions, not just for your family or your career family, but also the teachers inside the building, so they actually understand what it is that you're doing and how your professional growth perhaps may line up with some of their standards. Have you done any cross training like that?
I know we've been working on that working with the teachers and other admin and things to integrate that training. I know at the beginning of the school year, we all go through some of the same trainings from and we're all mixed in together, whether it be teachers, bus drivers, everybody's included in those trainings, and we rotate through those trainings together, not just as the ESPs, but also with the teachers, the administration. And so as we do that, we get to hear from the different other organizations on how to improve our, professionalism and development to be better within our job families and also other job families. And I think that's important that continues to happen.
Good, thank you. Dorothy, are there any other questions in the chat that you've come across?
Yes, so thank you, Adrian, James, Joe, Vanessa, for such an informative presentation and discussion. At this time, we will open the floor for Q&A. We will address the questions in the order in which they have been received until we run out of time. So as a reminder, only questions posted in the Q&A feature will be included in this portion of the webinar. And if you have posted a question in the chat box, please restate your question using the Q&A feature, so then it can be included in our discussion. So I did see one question that just came up, and it was directed to James, but he had to leave. And I think this is something that Joe could answer too, if you could. The question is, did you ever experience any issues or problems with police officers during your journey at your campus?
Actually, I've been very fortunate that I've worked with many officers or SROs, and most of my dealings have been positive because the work agreement that we've had with each other is that there's if I present anything to them, then that's when they would be involved. Otherwise, things would be a school issue, not so much referring kids to the police officer for certain things. Only in very small circumstances did that happen. But most of the time, everything was positive, and we did not involve the SRO.
Okay, thanks, Joe. There's another question that came through, and I think this is something that either Joe or Vanessa can answer. Do you see other police departments changing their names or titles of SRO across the state? Is that something that's going on in Arizona right now?
So we have had, our district is the largest high school district. So we are a big component of high schools. So we have had discussions with like the city of Phoenix and different organizations to see how can we make the change so that it's not so scary. Our students are so afraid to see those police officers. So we have had those discussions over the last year. And as you can imagine, it even ramped up more this year, that those discussions became even more important so that we can make those decisions that are needed moving forward in order to, yes, keep our kids safe, but how do we change the language, not just in our district, but with the I guess the law enforcement agencies that we have to use or are being told to use. So yeah, we are definitely having those conversations. I mean, we have to at this point in time.
Great. So as you all know, students are learning through a variety of instruction formats right now, depending on where they live. What is a role you think ESPs can play to ensure an equitable and safe learning environment for students more in like the virtual space? And that could be anybody, Adrian or Vanessa.
So I know in our district, we are using like our instructional assistants to be a part of those virtual classrooms so that students have that extra person. A lot of times, students come to the ESPs first. That's the first person they see in the morning. That's usually the person they see before going home. So we're making sure that we have those instructional assistants or the paraprofessionals still in those virtual learning environments so the students have that additional adult or the adult they're used to seeing in person now online so they can take their concerns to them. We've also looked at just making sure we continually send out messaging to the students and doing surveys, like how are you feeling? How are there any concerns? So we just sent out another survey probably about a month ago, just to see how our students are feeling. And we did the same survey for our adults. How are you feeling, and how is this virtual environment working out for you? And do you feel safe? Whether it's safe on the amount of time you're spending online, or do you feel safe with anything that goes on in the chats or anything of that sort? So we're trying different things. It's just so new to everybody that figuring out how to do it is, I guess, you're learn as you go, for lack of better words.
I have nothing to add to that, but I do want to put a question out there for people to grapple with. And this goes back to the importance of language. And we've talked a lot about, changing from the SRO to more safety. And I understand the importance of language, the power of language. But what about the phraseology of defunding the police? How has that played out inside of the your school resource officers, with inside the safety team and so on? Do they, and what happened with George Floyd and all the other racial events and massacres and deaths and things that have triggered since the pandemic even, and your students are home by themselves trying to grapple with that. How have you been able to deal with that? In other words, I think the first question I would want to ask is, defund the police. What does that mean to your team? How has your team been able to handle that? And also, we already know that with one of the situations that happened earlier in May, I think it is, or June, in New York, where a group of Black police officers separated themselves from their masses because they didn't like the idea that the vast majority of white police officers were backing Donald Trump. So how does race sometimes get caught up into that? And how does the George Floyd situation get caught up into that? How does defund the police get caught up into that? And you guys are there at the nexus, at all those various intersections. So how do you handle all those stressors?
So in our district, most of the districts in Arizona have started moving away from using actual law enforcement agencies. What we did in our district, it was a novel idea. We've taken that line of dollars and we've put it back in the hands of the employees to decide, what does safety look like on your campus and what is that proposal? So right now we're going through the process of participatory budgeting with the employees, with all of our ESPs. So we have taken those dollars, I guess they'd be the defund the police dollars, and putting out there, what would you do with these dollars to increase campus safety? So that was something we've done, and we're working on it right now. We have a parent component, a student component, but this is the first time we've really had all stakeholders in by adding in the staff component so that we can speak to what those dollars should be spent on. So we're going through that process now. And it's really, like Joe said, I've worked on sites. I was in security at one point in my career, and we had good SROs and we have bad ones. And so I worked with a few that were just amazing. And, a Black police officer, and even all of our students of color, Hispanic, Black, they all were drawn to him because of how he carried himself and he looked and was a part of their community. And then we've had others that they still are very focused on, this is my uniform and this is a job. And so trying to get those people out of our schools is sometimes hard. So it's just a continual struggle, but I think the participatory budgeting is something that districts should look at. I really think it's something we should take seriously.
There are great opportunities in that. I'm going to throw this back over to Jessica and Dorothy. But before I throw it back over, I want to thank everyone very much for taking time with a very hectic schedule to spend your time here this evening with us for the past 75 minutes. I think that this topic is so timely, so relevant, so critical to all of us, and especially to our students who are living through this each and every second of the day. So again, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity and giving me the space to talk with you tonight, to engage in a very rich discussion. So thank you. Back to you, Jessica and Dorothy.
Thanks, Adrienne. We do actually have one more question if Vanessa or Joe doesn't mind answering. When dealing with a student that has emotional concerns, will you refer that student to a school nurse or a counselor, or do you call on outside resources?
You can speak, Joe, you were like.
Okay, I'll answer that. I know when I come across a student that might be in a situation, sometimes I deal with it myself because, as part of my job and training that I've had, I've learned how to, when students are having emotional crisis or what have you, of how to, take them in and deal with that. And then when it becomes more than what I can handle, then I get the right person in and turn the student over to make sure that student gets the needed help.
All right, thank you, Joe. So we actually have one more, probably the last one. How have you discussed how to change the practices of policing and discipline in schools that have been harmful for students as part of the conversation about changing the names?
I think we've worked really well in looking at programs. So we're doing more of our own support services, creating support services teams, which includes our safety supervisor, all of our security. So really looking at the resources within the campus so that we can take care of those issues or challenges that our students and staff are facing right there. It's more comfortable when you see a familiar face and the person, families who've seen Joe for 25 years, they're going to feel comfortable having those conversations. So really just addressing them and working with your school, your district to create those support teams on your site. It's important.
And there's a lot of schools using more restorative programs, restorative practices, helping the educators to understand what they are, what they look like.
Right, and we use those in our district as well. Our Joe can speak. He's part of those teams. We've tried to incorporate as much as we can to have our students talk through it, and not using referrals, having conversations instead of referrals, and it goes a really long way. It makes a difference.
I think also what we've done, I know on our campuses, we've created a student support center. And so within that support center, our social worker, our interventionist, our community liaison, and are within that area. So when we have kids and that needs attention, there's multiple of folks that are in there to help the kids in that situation. And so they all work within that one room with multiple offices.
Excellent.
Thanks again for sharing your valuable insights. It looks like that's all the questions we have for tonight, so I'm going to pass it back to Jessica, who will conclude the webinar.
To request a general session-specific certificate of completion as a participant of recorded sessions, please send your request by emailing espqweb@nea.org. All requests must include the session title and the on-screen certificate of completion code. Session certificates will not be provided if your viewer code is not included in the email request. Note, due to limitations in our ability to track attendance for live sessions, requests for personalized certificates will only be provided for participants of live webinars whose attendance can be verified. The certificate received for viewing recorded sessions will be session specific, but will not include personalized names. Again, those requests should be sent to espqweb@nea.org, and it must include the session title and the on-screen certificate of completion code. At this time, I would like to, on behalf of the Center of Great Public Schools, NEA ESP Quality Department, as well as our Teacher Quality Department, thank you all for presenting this evening, as well as for attending tonight's webinar. And thank you for your active participation. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and good night from the ESP Quality Department.